Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong and Sonatype. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of TechStrong Learning. We have an exciting panel or presentation, but first we have a few housekeeping notes. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of the discussion or you'd like to share it with a friend, the on-demand will be made available shortly after we conclude today's webinar. If you have any questions for Sal today, we want you to direct those into the Q&A tab, which you can find on the right side of your screen. Or if you have any comments or just want to let us know from where you're tuning in, we want you to send those comments into the chat tab. Finally, at the conclusion of today's webinar, we will have a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so stick around to see if you're one of our 4 lucky winners. On to our topic today, we'll be discussing lessons learned from the Log4j exploit. And I'm joined today by Sal Kimmich, Head of Developer Relations at Sonatype. Sal, it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to you. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for joining. If you can see my slides now, we are going to be talking about Log4j, or the Log4 debacle. And this is the 0 day that set the internet on fire late last year and continues to burn this year. If you're not familiar with this expression, 0 day is something that we use in cybersecurity to define the historical date at which a vulnerability is made public, after which you are given a very limited amount of time to be able to make your own systems less vulnerable to attack. Again, I'm Sal Kimmich. I'm an open source developer advocate at Sonatype, and let's walk you through this. So here's what we're going to learn today. We're going to break this into 4 easy parts. We're going to start with what the modern software supply chain looks like and really how that works with open source. We're going to discuss the Log4j story so far and where it might be going. We're going to talk about the current enterprise response, and then we're really going to finish up with what you can do about that, whether you're a developer, a CISO, or a security researcher. So let's talk about the modern software supply chain. Open source really is not just a lot of libraries sitting out there on the internet. This is something that has become central to industry. And whether or not you realize it, it's something that you are absolutely dependent on. If you are listening to this talk right now, you realize that entirely. And you may have seen this XKCD more than once, but it doesn't become less important. When we are leaning on open source today, it means that you are leaning on a generation of software development that was done largely on a volunteer basis, but now has become something that's central to the enterprise applications that we use every day. So your modern industrial infrastructure may be dependent on 1 to 3 individuals that are maintaining your packages. And there's really important consequences to that we're going to dive into. So I'm about to show you a bunch of statistics that I think are really important, but you should understand where these are coming from. I work at Sonatype specifically because of the intelligence that they provide. Now, we have researchers, dozens of researchers across every single language ecosystem that help us to identify when new vulnerabilities occur. They allow us to get to them in a timely manner. If we can, we identify those and we allow those ecosystems themselves to be aware of them. So we contact the repositories for Python, for Java, and we try to get them removed before they ever go into your system. But there are still leaky packages that get through. And this is the way that we allow you to understand when these vulnerabilities are coming through, and we allow you to have actionable insights for what to do next. So your modern software supply chain, if you're working in enterprise, looks like this. 90% of your code is coming from open source. It means that 2.2 trillion packages were downloaded just in 2021, and that is exponentially increasing. And the average single enterprise downloads 373,000 open source components in a year. So what does this really mean for you? When I say that 90% of your application is made of open source components, there's another really good way to consider this. It means that think of your entire developer team Now think that your entire development team may represent just 1 in 9 of the developers that are producing the code that allows your application to run. If you understand it that way, it becomes much more important for you to understand and engage in the open source supply chain. Now, this open source supply chain has 21,000 new versions of open source packages released every single day. And this is increasing in every single ecosystem that we're seeing because it's becoming more important. We have more contributors and we have more enterprise engagement over time as they begin to realize that this is so central to their business value. So, depending on where you are sitting inside of an enterprise, you're going to be typically sitting in one of these roles. Now, what does this mean for you? If you're a developer, the question that you want to answer is how hard is it going to be to upgrade a given package? How hard is it going to be to integrate a new package as I'm developing a new feature? If you're an enterprise, in operations and enterprise, you really want to be able to answer the question, where do we have it running at all times? If you're in security, you want to understand how you can mitigate the risk to vulnerabilities as they do inevitably come into your system. If you're in legal, you really want to understand if there's going to be litigation consequences if there is a breach into your software system. And if you're sitting in DevOps, you're going to be asking where in the software delivery lifecycle this is being downloaded. And this is especially important as we move into the narrative of Log4j and why there continues to be vulnerable downloads. It's particularly because we're using CI/CD that is allowing this to re-enter our systems, even if we think that we've done manual mitigation. So the Log4j story so far, this is a zero-day attack that happened in December. This hit on December 10th, and there are still ongoing attacks and patching efforts as we move forward. This is incredibly important. Log4j is such a big deal because of what it does. It is a logging mechanism. So even if you are not focusing on something that is a Java-centric architecture, we have seen Log4j be implemented in all kinds of different architectures. It's because it's an incredibly simple way to be able to observe and record the state of a software system. So even if you're reliant on a completely different architecture, one of the primary spaces where we really saw this attacked the most has actually been in blockchain. It's because it's a space where you would lean on Log4j just to be able to understand the state of your system and get that recorded. And this is affecting over 1/3 of the software downloads that we see online. And if you're an enterprise, this probably does still mean you. So let's step back to this narrative. No matter where you are inside of an enterprise system, if you've been affected by Log4j, what you've probably been most impressed or overwhelmed by is this, that since December, there have been 5 updates and 5 patches to this open source package that we are dependent on. We don't have a great alternative for it. So what you'll see is that we had the original CVE. We had another CVE that was critical. We had a couple others that became more moderate as time went on, but they're still important. Now, this is a screenshot that I took from the Log4j Vulnerability Resource Center. Again, at Sonatype, we are behind the Maven Central repository, and we have the up-to-date access for who is and what it looks like to have the downloads for every Java package in that ecosystem. So as of today, we've been oscillating between 36 and 40% vulnerable downloads. Even today, we're 3 months down the line. Now, when you look at the colors on this, this means that we still have a considerable number of enterprises and individuals that are downloading not just a vulnerable version, but the most vulnerable version. And as you look down these from red to green, we're still only seeing that a minority of enterprises and individuals are downloading the least vulnerable update to this. And this is incredibly important because, as I mentioned, with a 0 day, the more time passes, the more likely you are to be suspect to a unethical, a black hat intervention into your system. Now, if you think that you've cleaned everything up inside of your source code, I want you to reflect on this. The last major vulnerability that we saw that looked very similar to this was the struts vulnerability in 2017. Now, the most infamous vulnerability that we've seen in a decade was the Equifax breach. Now, if you look at this, this goes to tell a really interesting story. The 0 day for the struts vulnerability was about 6 months before the Equifax breach. So there was a public disclosure of this vulnerability before the major breach. Now, if you're paying attention, we're 3 months now into this Log4j, Log4shell vulnerability. It's very likely that we are less than 3 months away from another major enterprise being taken down by this. And I'm not telling you this as a scared narrative. I really am not selling anything here. What I'm trying to explain to you is that these vulnerabilities are ubiquitous and that allows them to be hidden, and you really need to pay attention to where they might be. So, as we have begun to assess and try to take care of the cleanup of Log4j and trying to find these vulnerable versions, there have been many, many different attempts to be able to show you where this is sitting in the code. So there have been quite a few bespoke attempts to provide interventions for developers, for operations, particularly for security, but also for legal and DevOps. And in these cases, you're going to be able to find a specific bespoke script that's been provided by almost every major provider. You're going to see things that allow you to see, can I look for these hiding under the hood of our unmanaged and shaded jars? And do note this particularly, if you do not believe that you have Log4j still sitting in your system after you've done a manual analysis, it's very likely that this is sitting in your jars and your Uber jars. So make sure to open those up. Make sure to look at those. If it's not sitting there, it may be sitting inside of some of the other open source packages that you're still beginning to take in. Understand that if you're dealing with an open source supply chain, other packages that you are taking in also have their own dependencies, and they may not have had the enterprise cybersecurity support to be able to remove Log4j from their code. So you could be bringing it in even after you've ensured that it's not in your own source code. So let's talk a little bit about what the 0 day looked like for this. So on December 9th and 10th, we saw the initial exploit for Log4shell, and that was a 0 day leak on GitHub. This vulnerability disclosure allowed for a public understanding of where this was and what it did. It also allowed for an entirely new generation of pen testers who took this information, it's a very simple exploit, and started to look for it more broadly in enterprise systems, both to help and to harm. This first 0 day vulnerability was a class 10 critical score. That is the highest score that you can receive. This is something that you cannot ignore, not for a day, not for a week. You definitely cannot ignore it for 3 months. So when we're looking at some of the statistics behind this, when we're still seeing this high percentage of vulnerable downloads, we don't think that people are doing it on purpose. This is such a ubiquitous package, and that's why it's so concerning. It can slip in to your code base without you knowing in several different ways. So what did the alpha variant of this really look like? So if you want to understand the mechanics behind this, we're going to explain this in a couple of different ways, but I think this is the best way to really understand why this is so powerful. So log4shell is a Java naming and directory interface. So JNDI, that allows for the unauthenticated, oh dear, the unauthenticated remote code execution. So adversaries can use this really, really simple line of code in order to call an entire Java object. Typically, what you're trying to do is just call the name, the server, understand the information of a system, but that also allows for an unauthenticated end user to insert executable code. And in this case, they might be putting executable code into your source code that they do not intend to use until they require some sort of gain from it. So whether or not they want to be stealing your data, whether or not they want to use that for a ransomware, this really simple line of code is the serious problem that we've been looking at. And if you want to understand this in great detail, really do look at this Bleeping Computer article that was written by one of our research analysts on exactly why this is affecting our products. So let's consider what the enterprise response has been to this over the last 3 months. So very immediately after this came out in December, there was a good and positive response from some major enterprises. So this is a really simple example of understanding the understanding of the JNDI LDAP that allows you to hook right into an application using Log4j. And then an attacker can go and put a malicious Java object right into your system, and they can do it without your level of awareness. And that's why a mass exploitation of this has occurred. Attackers are using mass scanning to understand where a Log4j version is occurring. They're also using some of those bespoke scanners that we have seen from individuals and enterprises that are allowing you to go in and look at any open source code and understand where this might be sitting. The threat actors are often installing crypto miners or other ransomware, and this is becoming a major exploit. We're not seeing the end tail of this. We're probably seeing the beginning of a tornado. So let's talk about a really important specific example of this. So fintech has been particularly hit by this, and for good reasons. They have highly exploitable data. So a fintech firm was recently hit by this Log4j vulnerability. Now, it's because they had both Log4j vulnerability, but they also had a poor AWS configuration that enabled lateral movement. It enabled them to remove and move that data out so that after capturing it, they had access to over 2 million customer records. And this was incredibly sensitive data. This was names, this was passports, this was selfie videos, which could be used to extort not just enterprise, but the individuals themselves, and it could be used to fake identities very easily. So the customer information retrieved here by using that Java object was the following. You can get names, emails, phone numbers, addresses, encrypted passwords, transaction history. You can get other encrypted information by using this exploit. And I think this really drives home why this combination of the ability to call forth a Java object and the ability to access from an external user into a system makes this so powerful and makes this so scary and makes this so much worse even likely than the threats that we saw just a couple of years ago. So when this occurred, crypto platforms also were extorted in this. Again, as I said, a lot of blockchain technologies were heavily hit by this because they use this as a way to externally log their information. Now, when this occurred for a crypto platform, this firm's data was put up for sale, and the unredacted IDs and passport images, selfies, databases were all shared online. So this is no longer just affecting enterprises. They're leveraging the fact that we are collecting so much data about individuals, and that this form of exploit allows us to see those individual sets of data. It allows us to extract those so easily if you don't have the right protections in place. Another great example of this was that Night Sky ransomware has exploited VM Horizon servers. So they're really exploiting a enterprise class service to be able to attack multiple enterprises at once. Now, let's move a little bit from enterprise to the way that federal or government or nation state services have started to look at this and also been affected. So the FTC has warned businesses to patch Log4j vulnerability immediately. They've been doing this for months. The CISA's emergency initiative has already demanded that government agencies patch before the new year. The FTC says patch or risk getting sued, but getting sued is really the lowest limit risk here. If you got sued before you had a breach, it means you got off easy. You're likely going to have a breach before you get sued. So you cannot ignore this. And I want to make this very clear that this is a global problem. We don't see that any country is doing particularly better or particularly worse. You can see trends on the left-hand side here. And again, these are from today of the way that different countries are handling their patching of these vulnerabilities. Some countries are much stronger than others. There is a circumstantial evidence to state that perhaps those countries that have a better distribution of cybersecurity information in English may be performing better. But there's absolutely no evidence to me that the hypothesis that any individual nation state is doing better or worse is due to any other nation state. And just looking at this global map of high and low performance really shows us this. There's no nation state block that's performing exceptionally well or exceptionally worse. And these are continuing to vary as new vulnerabilities and new patches come out. It depends on what countries and what enterprises are willing to keep up with the new game of having 0 days landing all the time. So the Belgian government was one of the first to confirm a cyber attack from Log4j and to be very public about that attack. Netherlands was also shut down by a major Log4j exploitation. Ukraine has been entirely defaced on their international affairs site because of a Log4j vulnerability. And Russians have experienced ransomware from this attack. So there's no global narrative that really speaks to this. This is really individual actors going after individual sites, individual source codes, and seeing what they can get into if there are hidden Log4j or Log4 shells still stuck inside of that code. The White House has come out and issued in January 13th that open source security is a national security issue. And this is absolutely true. This is true for every single country. The White House has urged government and private organizations to dedicate their efforts to security after Log4j. They want this to have a vast usage amongst the national security usage. And there has been a recent executive order on supply chain security. We now realize that it is not physical borders where attacks are most likely to take place. Your biggest surface area as a nation state is your cybersecurity. And if you don't take care of issues like Log4j and whatever the next 0 day is coming up, you will be vulnerable, and that will be a national security issue. So as we mentioned in the slide before, there have been 5 Log4j CVEs so far. Now, they've been variable in how critical they were. The first few were very critical, 10 out of 10. Some have been moderate. That doesn't mean that any of them are less important. It doesn't mean that the next critical vulnerability will not be 10 out of 10. It depends on what and how successful the form of exploit is. And as we continue to evolve in the open source supply chain, again, the open source supply chain is only about a decade, maybe 15 years old. As we are discovering these zero-day vulnerabilities, they're things we, as a global society, have literally never seen before. So you do have to pay attention. You do have to see this in real time. And you have to respect that a zero-day vulnerability may stop your entire enterprise. It may stop feature development, but it's much better to stop, reconsider, and make sure that you put out that fire rather than putting out a feature which makes your entire enterprise vulnerable to attacks, especially if they can put executing code into your code. Now, this is not to scare you as well. As we have seen specifically for Log4j, some of the subsequent patches that have come through have been for less severe versions of vulnerabilities. These are not all held equal. And particularly in this case, there's very good news to know that the maintaining team for this package, understanding that they are a global necessity, have become much better at making cybersecurity and authorization limits to what you can put in. And now they're offering some of these things that were allowing hackers, allowing these malicious acts to go into place much harder to put in place, just because they're not putting the onus of education on developers necessarily, and definitely not on security teams. What they're doing instead is making sure that some of these more questionable elements that allow you to have this full root access are only opt-in. So you really have to know what you're doing and make an active and positive choice to put those in place if that is something that you want to put into the way that you design your software. So here's what we can do about it. So there's a couple of really simple solutions that can prevent log4shell exploits and can prevent future 0 days, which are going to be coming. It can be hard to access the full impact of manually going through your source code. Again, Log4j is so ubiquitous. If you do not have it in your fundamental architecture, if you are bringing in 90% open source packages, it's very likely that it's still sitting in one of those packages. And you have to become aware of how you can seed through your dependency trees to be able to know where those are. And in that case, you may be able to remove that instance. You may have to choose a different package. You may, and I would really recommend this, reach out to that open source maintaining team and see what you can do to work together to provide the enterprise cybersecurity understanding and support to fix that open source package so that you can maintain that open source ecosystem. Again, if 90% of your packages are open source, 9 out of 10 of the developers that built the code that your enterprise run on aren't on your payroll. This doesn't mean that their code isn't valuable. In fact, you know it is. You know that you have to use it. The reason why we are dealing with Log4j is because it cannot be redacted from a lot of the architecture that we use. It's too useful, and there is no alternative that does the work that this does. Because it is intractable, the onus is now on enterprise to reach out, to do that hard work, and to make sure that they understand that those developers may not be on payroll, but the consequences of the hygiene of those open source packages absolutely will impact your enterprise. And if you don't think about that, there's no solution here. So do use free scanners. There's many free scanners that allow you to search for this. I'd recommend using more than one. And then make sure that you're using security and firewalls for your enterprise systems so that new and vulnerable versions, as soon as they're highlighted, as soon as that CVE comes out, are not allowed to come into your system. Another really simple, and I know it's very obvious, but make sure that you patch. You always patch when a new CVE comes back. Make sure that you patch it and you patch it quickly. Make sure that you patch it inside of a sprint. Try to patch it inside of half a week at the minimum. If you can go faster, then you will be more secure. What hackers are looking for are systems that allow themselves to have a vulnerable surface area for as long as possible. If they are trying to get into your source code, they're not going to look for a system that regularly patches. They're going to look for the system that has not undergone a patch for a month, for 2 months, because they understand that they may be able to get into your system and it could be a month or 2 or 3 or 6 of exploitation before they want to make their move. But you also want to be doing this with due diligence. So make sure that the updates that you make are legitimate and that they're safe and that they don't break anything. Now, again, this is not just a developer concern, this is a cybersecurity concern these days. So, on the other side of making sure that you continuously patch, there are typo squatting and there are new versioning ways of some of these ecosystems allowing for version updates of your most used open source packages. And statistically, it is the most used open source packages that are most likely to have malware seeded into them because of how quickly they get distributed by continuously updating software. It's particularly the Dependabots, it's the continuously updating software automation that allows occasionally for a system to be patched. But in that patch, you're not getting the true new version. You're getting a variation on that, which may itself have malware coming in. So in this stage, I really do recommend that you ensure that you are patching, but you have a semi-manual look at that. And that's probably going to change inside of the next 1 to 2 years. We are actively developing tooling, not just at Sonatype, but across the board to make sure that that is not an issue that occurs. But again, this is just so quickly moving that you have to make sure to protect yourself on both sides, both patch but verify. It's no longer trust but verify. It's patch but verify because the patching is inevitable. And I like to end that line of thought with, I think, my favorite tweet from the end of last year. So I love this expression that the perfect ending to cybersecurity for 2021 was a 90s style Java vulnerability and open source module written by 2 volunteers with no funding, used by large cybersecurity vendors, undetected for 7 to 8 years. Let's be clear that the original version, which introduced this vulnerability, was around for almost a decade before the 0-day was made public. And it was undetected until systems like Minecraft chat got brought down and no one knew how to respond properly. So what does this really mean for the open source supply chain? The first slide that I brought us into was that XKCD reminder that our enterprise systems are typically run by 2 to 3 volunteers with no funding. Now, let's bring attention to another form of attack that is really, really interesting. So this is not a cybersecurity attack. This was an intentional sabotage by an open source package maintainer. So in the NPM ecosystem, some of the most popular libraries ever developed were Colors and Faker. Now, these were developed by a maintainer who maintained these for years, almost a decade, and did so without funding. They requested funding over a course of 2 years from many of the major enterprises that were dependent on it, and did not receive that. Again, if you're getting free code, what's the motivation to change, especially if you are allowed to request free feature updates, free patches, free labor over time for hard work that makes revenue producing enterprise do its work? We're seeing a backlash now of the open source supply chain. Now, this is a supply chain that's unlike any other. This has been an invisible industrial revolution where a generation of volunteer developers have built the internet, and they have not had equitable pay for that. So, as we have to continue to be concerned about cybersecurity attacks that can come in from bad actors, You should also be concerned about what the open source supply chain will look like if you, as an enterprise consumer, do not turn your face back to the individuals and the teams that have provided you this free software, because this was one high-profile example of a tidal wave of what we might see coming down the line. Labor is labor, and if it's not paid for, we might be seeing some parts of the open source supply chain break down. So in this case, there was a pretty simple solution. In this one, a great workaround was just to downgrade to a lower version. But this was sabotaged not by an unethical hacker. It wasn't sabotaged by someone who was looking to get their name out or to target a specific enterprise. This was just targeted by the maintainer who no longer wanted to do free labor that was exploited by thousands of enterprises. Now, this was an incredible and kind of fantastical example, but we could be seeing more of this come down the line if you do not do your due diligence as an enterprise and turn around to those packages and understand that if 90% of your enterprise software is open source, 9 out of 10 of the developers that built the software that you depend on are not on your salary. Now, if you want to work with those developers, if you want to make sure that the supply chain that allows us to have this incredible human creativity can still occur, we absolutely have to support them. And in this single case, we have found that the faker functional code was actively removed from GitHub and it was replaced with a non-vulnerable version. But let's pay attention to this because this was not just a bad actor stepping in. This was the maintainer of these systems standing up and saying, look, if we provide you your functional code, we should be paid for that. So I don't know if this is the future of not cybersecurity, but open source vulnerability concerns. But this is really what I am paying the most attention to over the next year because I would likely believe that we're going to see more of this occur over time. So if you are part of a software development team, you're making choices like this all of the time. So you are looking at macro versus micro architectural decisions. What does that really mean? So if you are doing a microservice architecture, which all of us are, then you're making macro architectural decisions. You're deciding what packages will work together and what packages are possibly most stable working together over time. As we're starting to deal with being able to understand and support vulnerabilities and changes to the update in these packages, you have to shift your attention to micro dependency decisions. Which package, not just package, which of the versions of an individual package are the best for you to choose because they support your features and are also least vulnerable. This isn't something we've really had to deal with before the last 2-3 years because the software supply chain itself has accelerated at an exponential rate. So it used to be feasible for a manual or semi-manual process to make the decision around the architecture that you want to put in place. It used to be feasible to sit down and actually draw out a diagram of the architecture that you wanted to be able to use and to be able to assume that that was going to be stable into production. That's no longer the case. You need to be really specific about understanding why you're bringing in a package, how often it updates, if it is typically vulnerable, and that is how you want to make your decision about bringing in your packages from open source. Now, that's incredibly hard, and that brings us into a new age where we probably cannot be doing this manually. And as it stands right now, we're at the breaking point of going from manual to automated decision making. 69% of dependency management decisions, and when I talk about dependency here, I'm talking about the packages that you consume and the packages that you consume consume, right? There's many layers to the tree that allows your system to run. But as it stands, with the information that most of these development teams have, 69% of them are making suboptimal decisions. So only 3% of developer teams tend to make the worst decision possible, and I'm grateful to see that. But I'm very concerned to see that 64% of developer teams are making imperfect decisions, meaning they are making a decision to intake a package that might be vulnerable in itself. It might be vulnerable because of another package that it is co-vulnerable with inside of your architecture. Only 1% are making dead-end decisions where they may be absolutely architecturally locked into a package that they have no alternative to. But again, 31% of these development teams are making the optimal decisions, either by chance or probably mostly by information. So you really have to stay on top of this. You have to understand, what is the version that I should be moving towards? Now, this does come from our intelligence. These are hard facts. These are not assumptions. These are not averages. This speaks to the real knowledge of when developers brought in packages that were optimal, imperfect, or suboptimal. So really pay attention to this. And if you take one thing back, think about where your development team might sit in this distribution and what you might do in the way that you manage packages to make sure that you are optimal moving forward. So how can you prevent supply chain attacks? Really simply, SBOMs. They're not just becoming mandated, they're absolutely what you should be using to understand what is inside of your code. So an SBOM is a software bill of materials, and what that gives us is the same as you would get on most food. It gives you an ingredients list, and it tells you exactly what and where these are coming into this list of packages that could be vulnerable, where they are sitting inside of your architecture, so that you can go and define them. If there's a CVE, you can remove them immediately, and you can make those patches without any trouble. It's the time to find it inside of your code that makes you more susceptible as you're moving forward day after day after day after 0 day. If you have an SBOM, your 0 day can be the same day as your patch. Verify the integrity of your code. Make sure that what you're bringing in is valid. These malicious upstream attacks, we're seeing these increasingly because they're easy in some of these ecosystems. And it's very easy to lean on automation that allows you just to bring in the most recent version. But that's where some of these malware attacks are taking place. It's not possible for us to manually track dependencies. As I've explained to you, it's no longer macro architectural decisions, it's micro architectural decisions. It's deciding between version 15 or 16 or 17 and making some decisions about that based on your architecture. You really cannot make these choices by manually looking through your code. But some kind of deep binary analysis is absolutely necessary. So scanning is something we absolutely have to keep doing. We have to develop better ways of doing our scanning as we try to capture these in as near to real time on a 0 day as possible. But if you're still trying to do this manually, you're going to be vulnerable. We need tools that can dig through obfuscated or minified code. This is incredibly important for Log4j because, again, if you think that this is no longer in your code after you've done a top-level scan of your system, it's probably still, it could still be sitting, and I'm hoping it's not, but there is a, by the statistics, 40% chance that that is sitting in your jars or your Uber jars that you just haven't opened up and scanned. So you need to look through those and see if they're there. If they're not there, they may be being brought in by open source packages that you are absolutely dependent on. And again, Log4j just logs a system. A lot of these open source packages have leaned on it just as you did if it was in your system. Sophisticated techniques are allowing us to need manual intervention as we continue to develop these out. But again, we're trying to develop scanning processes that can intervene in these. If you don't have a strong cybersecurity team in your enterprise, you need one now. These are not slowing down, they're exponentially increasing. Now, in addition to all of these basic parameter controls, authorization controls, network monitoring, we need to be able to spot malicious traffic. And this is where I start to lean on some of my background from site reliability engineering. We really need to be considering this as a continuing monitoring capacity. You're always going to have a risk of 0 days. There are going to be vulnerabilities that come up. But if you have a compound effect of vulnerabilities, that's something which will take down an enterprise. A single vulnerability could take down an enterprise. But having compounding effect of vulnerabilities means that you will bring your acceleration of software delivery to a halt. So you need to consider this in a way where you need not just continuous delivery, not just continuous integration. We now all need continuous cybersecurity. And I hope that you can take that away from this talk. Now at Sonatype, we have been focused on the open source software supply chain for over a decade. There's just a couple of things that I would really highlight here if you are enterprise or leaning towards becoming enterprise. We have an excellent firewall, which allows us to use our real-time intelligence to inform whether or not you should be bringing in a package or a new version of a package into your source code. But the one thing I really do want to highlight here is Sonatype Lift. Now, this is a free and free forever tool that you can be using on any open source repository that you have. If you have a private repository, it's just a paid resource. But this changes the game in the way that you are able to find critical and non-critical vulnerabilities. If you're using Sonatype Lift, this is a product which now will go and scan every time there is a pull request, every time you make a code change pre-production. And it allows you to know if you have a vulnerability. It also gives you a couple other, assets. It lets you know if there's some style recommendations. You can turn those on and off as you like, but it's these vulnerabilities that are crucial. And it will tell you inside of a pull request if a vulnerability has taken place. And there are options there to not just be aware. We are not just trying to give you a bleeding red flags on your development process. We're also trying to tell you what the best actions you can take in real time are. So we'll be able to tell you not just if you're receiving a vulnerable version, but what version is most recommended for you to be able to make sure that when you absolutely merge that request, you have made sure that you have the least vulnerable, the most secure, the most resilient software that you can have in your software supply chain. My last note here is this was all driven by Nexus Intelligence. This is our differentiator. Again, as the Log4j debacle came to place, a lot of the other actors on the field had to develop bespoke mechanisms that allowed them to then go and scan for specifically these. We were able to catch it right away because we have access to the Maven Central repository, because we have been able to access, because we've been able to be in touch with these maintainers. We are focused on fixing the open source supply chain. We are not focused on selling you products that are going to kind of fix your problem 2 to 3 to 6 weeks after the vulnerability. And I mean that. I have been an open source maintainer. I have been an open source contributor. I really care about this. And I came to work for Sonatype because what we're doing here is fixing the open source supply chain. We are not selling you products that might help you with your enterprise. We are fixing what you are all dependent on. We are making sure that we're developing systems that make things work for not just the 1 in 9 of the developers that are on your salary. It's also those 9 out of 10 developers that provided the open source packages that your enterprise relies on. And that's incredibly important to me. So here's what we learned today. We talked about how the modern software supply chain works. We talked about the Log4j story so far and a little bit about how it continues to develop both for enterprise and for nation states. We talked about the enterprise response, and we talked a little bit about what we can do for it, not just in immediate remediation, but in how we need to look at what the real problem space is and some of the problems that we're going to continue to see as these software supply chains continue to exponentially evolve. If you enjoyed this talk today, if you want to learn more about the open source supply chain, then I'd really encourage you to go to dev.sonatype.com. This is DevZone. We talk a lot about the open source supply chain. We talk about dependencies. We bring up breaking news, security deep dives, developer culture, and coffee occasionally if we can get it to you. And we are the stewards of Maven Central. We've been here for over a decade, and we really believe in the work that we do. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the Log4j overview, the Log4Shell debacle, and to really understand the 0 day that set the internet on fire. My name's Sal Kimmich. If you want to reach out to me, you can always find me at Twitter at Kimmich_compute, and I would love to be in touch. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Sal. I would just like to quickly remind our audience that today's session was recorded. So if you missed any of our discussion or you'd like to share it with a friend, it will be made available shortly after we conclude today's recording. So quickly, we have 4 winners for our $25 Amazon gift card drawing. They are Asif M, Carol P, Hakan T, and John L. So congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim your gift card. And if you don't receive an email, just check your spam folder. So Sal, I'm not seeing any questions that came in today, and I'm seeing lots of praise in the comments. So is there anything that you'd like to leave our audience with before we officially close out today?
No, I think that's it. We will be having a webinar in just about a month. So if you want to deep dive on this topic that is not just a context understanding, but really an understanding of what this looks like in practice, I would absolutely love to have you join.
Perfect. And yeah, so if you did like what you heard today, me and Sal will be joining together on March 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern. The workshop is titled Culture Clash on PagerDuty, Why DevOps, SRE, and Cybersecurity Cultures Differ. We'll discuss how to structurally support shared aims with SLOs and create a better culture across teams in modern DevOps-driven enterprises. Does that about sum it up, Sal?
That's what I'll be talking about. I'm really excited.
Awesome. You and me both. So I'd like to extend our gratitude to Sonatype for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks goes to you, our audience. We really appreciate you being here with us. We hope that you will take some time to fill out our post-webinar survey. And we also hope to see you at a future TechStrong Learning webinar. Hint, hint, the workshop I just mentioned. So everyone, have a great rest of your day, and please stay safe out there.
Thank you.